Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is a special presentation by the Nutanix user group. And thank you for joining us on the topic of NC2 on Azure and AWS with Citrix. But before we start, if you could, in the chat, let me know if you're currently a user of NC2 on Azure or AWS. Just like to get a sense of what people are using out there at the moment. And if you're not, just let me know where you're beaming in from around the world. That'd be great. Yeah, I see. Neither. Yeah, I see. No, good. Great. I think, great, good. Switzerland, hi Switzerland. France, Minnesota, good. Great to see everyone. San Diego, nice. Good stuff. Great to get a sense of what our user group community is currently doing. So today's presentation, we're going to talk about NC2, and today's meeting will be recorded, so the recording will be sent out after the meeting. If you have any questions, I want you to share them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many as we can in the moment, and we'll do a follow-up with the answers as well. And at the end, we'll have a survey to let us know what you thought of today's session and what other kind of topics you would like us to bring to you. Today's speakers are, today's speaker is Jarian Gibson, a solution architect at Nutanix, and Joe, and I knew I was going to mess this one up, but Joe Riscali, product manager at Nutanix. And by the way, I've been practicing that for the last 15 minutes, folks. So it just, when it came time to say it, I couldn't do it, but I'm sorry, Joe. So with that, I'll kick it off, give it to Jarian, and he'll do the deep dive. Jarian?
Thank you, Angelo. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And we should be good to go. Can you see everything?
Yeah.
All right, so thank you. And by the way, Joe is our EUC PM at Nutanix, so feel free to ask him all of your questions and your wants and needs for EUC and Nutanix, because he's the guy to help you out. Today, we're going to talk about Nutanix cloud clusters with Citrix. So we'll kind of go through, multi-hybrid cloud with Citrix introduction, cloud clusters overview, Citrix on cloud clusters, additional resources. We'll have some questions at the end. And then we'll have some Nutanix user group stuff at the end as well from Angelo and team. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about Nutanix hybrid multi-cloud with Citrix introduction. So think about the stages of deploying EUC, specifically Citrix, in a hybrid deployment. You may have siloed brokers, right? You may be using the on-prem control plane from Citrix in your private cloud data center. And you might be using a different broker, possibly Citrix DaaS control plane for your public cloud, depending on your licensing from Citrix. Depending on what version of Citrix you're in, you might have two different control planes. You might be in that hybrid licensing state. You might be in that in-between state. But think about that when those things are siloed out, that you may have, separate brokers, separate images, separate everything. So everything is segregated, and you have two places you're looking to manage things. You may have, a different private cloud infrastructure than what's in the public cloud. You may be public cloud native, and think about all the challenges going back and forth between those two different platforms. As you go on to next, then you may start combining that into a single cloud broker between your private cloud and your public cloud. This could be the Citrix DaaS control plane. This could be the virtual apps and desktops control plane. Again, all depending on your licensing and your version of Citrix. So you bring those together as far as the control plane, but as far as the infrastructure sides, again, one set of infrastructure for your private cloud, and you may be in native public cloud deployments on Azure, AWS, GCP, etc. So still some challenges there, but the brokering side, you're unifying those two. So then think about when you get into a hybrid multi-cloud platform, right? So you have one common platform that can live across both of your private cloud and your public cloud deployments. Yes, we're still using public cloud resources, but the software, whether you're in the private cloud or the public cloud, is the same in between, and using that one unified control plane. And then you kind of get to where what we're going to talk about today is that single hybrid multi-cloud platform with Nutanix, the same software, whether you're in your private cloud or in your public cloud, and being able to bridge that to things like AWS, Azure, and any other clouds we go to in the future, along with that common broker from Citrix, being able to have that single pane of glass, being able to easily ship your base images or protect your persistent images and have the same look and feel no matter where you're deployed at. So that's kind of the theme we're going to talk about today. And the key here is going to be workload portability, whether that's the cloud control plane from Citrix, the on-prem control plane from Citrix, using our Nutanix Cloud Clusters control plane to manage those resources in the public cloud, and being able to deploy those workload VMs seamlessly across private cloud and public cloud with no lock-in, being able to simply just move around, being on-prem today, being AWS tomorrow, be in Azure the next day, be across all three, and then again, any cloud you may go to in the future, giving you kind of your choice of infrastructure, but having that single pane of glass of software, no workload refactoring, using all the same tools you're used to as far as administrating your Citrix deployments. So that brings us to being a single cloud platform for your Citrix digital workspace. Again, whether you're using the cloud control plane of Citrix DaaS or the customer managed control plane of virtual apps and desktops. Again, also talk about your licensing for Citrix, which we'll get to because there's been some changes there, but being able to have that one-click mobility and seamless operations across your hybrid cloud and public cloud for a multi-hybrid cloud deployment. And again, the theme here will be, same pane of glass, it's just software, seamless mobility, no refactoring. So think about those things and those challenges, and also that time to value as you want to get into a hybrid multi-cloud deployment with your Citrix workloads. So that brings us to this of Citrix and Nutanix kind of being, peas and carrots, the yin and the yang, whether you want to use Citrix DaaS or virtual apps and desktops and deploy that all on top of Nutanix. We do support, multiple hypervisors. When it comes to our Nutanix Cloud Clusters offering, it's going to be AHV. That's our own software, but we do have things built in per se, like if you are ESXi on-prem, we have things like cross-hypervisor DaaS recovery to be able to move back and forth between different hypervisors as well. With that being said, Citrix and Nutanix are, powering the future of work. We are the preferred HCI and higher multi-cloud solution for Citrix. Citrix is our preferred end-user computing solution on the Nutanix Cloud Platform. We meet pretty much our engineering teams, myself and Joe, along with the Citrix engineering teams and PMs, pretty much on a bi-weekly basis to go over a joint roadmap, integration, and to further improve how we work with each other. And that's been going on for over a year now with that bi-weekly engineering. And stay tuned for some changes coming as well to further improve our integrations with Citrix on Nutanix. So with that said, let's talk about Nutanix Cloud Clusters overview. So think about your journey, and I talked about those silos and differences between public and private, but instead of having that fork in the road where you have to pick one or the other, just think that you can have the best of both and not have to choose. So when you get into your private cloud, think about things like predictable workloads. It's cost effective, performance heavy. You have that full customization of what kind of hardware you want to have deployed, the hardware vendor, and a reliable ecosystem as well of choice of that hardware, and integrations like Citrix. And think about public, it's cloud native. You have to think about, are you going to use it for elastic or burst, possibly disaster recovery, just-in-time provisioning, using it for things like seasonal workloads. Think about retail and things like, Black Friday through the holidays. Think about, possibly any other time where they have big events where there's, lots of sales out there. Be able to quickly, burst that capacity, meet that demand very quickly, instead of having to go through and, procure that hardware, get it in, rack, stack, power, connected, all that kind of stuff you have to worry about. using the public cloud for those temporary times when you need that infrastructure pretty quickly to be able to burst to. So think about those two things as we look at the public cloud and the private cloud, but being able to bridge those things with Nutanix Cloud Clusters. So let's think about the new data center, right? So the new data center, traditionally it was in your data center. You possibly had the hardware co-located in a third-party data center, but it was still your hardware. Think about how things are changing, right? The landscape's changing. We're getting to that hybrid multi-cloud infrastructure, right? We want to be able to extend our data centers, or in some cases, even get rid of our own managed data centers and use public cloud infrastructure. Things of having that, instead of being tied to certain data centers, now moving into the public cloud, I have more regional availability. I can put workloads closer to my users as well if I'm distributed across, whether it's, the US, North America, the world, any different regions I need to deploy into. So that hybrid multi-cloud data center is basically that new data center, leveraging things like Azure, AWS, and then looking at some of our managed service partners for bare metal as a service, things like Equinix, Xterra, and OVH Cloud as well. Think about, things like latency can be introduced, how we're going to connect up, direct connect, VPN, express routes, going through different points of presence or POPs. And then think about, what applications do I have? Do I have native on-prem applications, or do I have cloud native applications that are SaaS applications? Be able to integrate across both or all of those options and being able to seamlessly move those workloads around between those. So think about the ideal state, which is basically the hybrid multi-cloud state, being able to unify both of those between private cloud and public clouds and across multiple public clouds, or being able to easily move out of one. I'm in AWS today, all of a sudden my direction changed in my business. I'm going to go to Microsoft, easily be able to move from AWS to Microsoft, or even come back on-prem, which we're seeing some customers do as well, without having to, do a lot of things of refactoring, licensing, lock-in, and so forth. So think about being able to merge those two things, be elastic, but also have predictable costs, have that high performance, but be able to support many services, have greater control, but also have ease of use, and all those things when you want to get to that ideal state of hybrid and multi-cloud and a unified platform. So think about how that adoption is challenging by having that unified between private and public cloud, right? Think about some of the things you have to do from an operations standpoint. Skill set, right? When you go from, private cloud of using things like, Nutanix and using AHV or Hyper-V or even ESXi Nutanix, and then changing that interface to go to native public cloud, learning Azure native stuff, learning AWS native stuff. Think about the skill set changing, new troubleshooting practices, refactoring, and so forth. And then think about, what about the integrations, right? Does my existing backup integrate with that? What's my disaster recovery plan? Do my monitoring tools work in that fashion? Do I need to change monitoring tools or augment the monitoring tools I have today? And then think about network and security policies. Do I need to change those? Do I need to retrofit those for the cloud? Learn new technology to do that? Or can I simply be able to use the same ones that I have on-prem and extend those into the public cloud? And then think about infrastructure. Do I have to, pick the certain t-shirt sizes of the workload VMs in public cloud? Do I want to get more custom with that by having, bare metal options like Nutanix Cloud Clusters, where I can fit those to my need, not be so restricted to certain t-shirt sizes by going into the public cloud? Also think about being able to seamlessly migrate, and then think about what kind of storage availability and performance as well. So all those things can come into play when you're extending your data center from private cloud and going into public cloud. So now let's talk about how we can imagine a true hybrid and multi-cloud architecture, right? So this is what Nutanix Cloud Clusters is going to offer you and allow you to do. It's going to be one cloud platform across both your public cloud and your private cloud deployments. Think about licensing as well. Can I simply take my licensing today and put that into the public cloud for the software I'm using? What about integration as well? Do I just bring my software in, use my existing cloud accounts, you pay for the software to have that seamless integration, but then you pay the cloud vendor directly for your cloud consumption. And then think about, again, we talk about lock-in. If I want to change clouds or I want to add another cloud to be a multi-cloud deployment, how easy is that? What's my time to value? How quickly can I move between those, between on-prem and public cloud? And think about the tools I need to do that. And then think about having a simple or a single platform across that, right? I run Nutanix today on-prem, that same interface, that same management style, the same things I'm used to of using things like protection domains or disaster recovery orchestration, or even using Flow, for example. Those same things can translate over to the public cloud in a true one cloud platform. So the main thing again here with Nutanix Cloud Platform is going to be ease of use and consistency. So being able to take our software, and again, on the cloud cluster, since we own the software, we can deploy that on bare metal nodes in the cloud. So it's going to be AHV. If you're AHV on-prem today, it's going to be the exact same look and feel as you would have in your private cloud data centers. If you're using things like ESXi, we can use cross-hypervisor DR to be able to seamlessly inject our services and tools on the fly and be up on AHV as quickly as you would be going between AHV and AHV public cloud and private cloud. And then, the only difference here is the underneath, right? So AWS, for example, you're going to be using EC2 bare metal instances, deploying in your own VPCs. In Azure, you're going to be deploying, in your VNets using Azure bare metal nodes. But once that piece is done, the software on top and the management layer is all the exact same look and feel. So go ahead, think about all those things we have on here about agility and cost effectiveness. Think about the unified multi-cloud management and experience. Think about the seamless migration as well. Again, the same tools built in, no refactoring, all the same single pane of glass that you're used to on-prem. Stretching PC across that, pairing multiple Prism Central instances or PC for different availability zones. But again, it's all the same tools, all the same things that we do to move those things around between on-prem and Azure and AWS. So again, that single cloud platform for your multi-hybrid cloud infrastructure, Prism just across that. So the Prism you have in your data center today, the same look and feel of Prism that you're going to have in Azure or AWS. And think about all the things that you do with that. Think about how you manage it, using our lifecycle management piece to seamlessly update the software, any kind of other software pieces like Files, Flow, Prism Central, etc. All that built in, all the same operations you're used to on-prem, and extending that into the public cloud. We're deploying this on bare metal nodes in the cloud, so we're not doing any kind of nested virtualization. Our Nutanix Cloud Clusters console is doing a similar foundation process that you would do by deploying clusters in your data center. We have a similar process to do that in the cloud on bare metal nodes to have just-in-time provisioning, and I'll talk about some other features as well that we have to be able to, easily deploy, shrink, expand, and other things that we can do as well. So again, the exact same look and feel, the exact same tools. The only difference is you're in AWS data center, you're in Microsoft data center. The terminology underneath is a little bit different based on the cloud, but the software on top is on bare metal nodes with the same pane of glass you're used to on-prem. So think about some of the highlights we have for capabilities. I mentioned one before, just-in-time scale and shrink. So just like on-prem, you start with 3 nodes to build a cluster out. Once you have those 3 nodes up and running, you can increase that a node at a time. You can also, add multiple nodes in parallel. You can also shrink back down to a minimum of 3 nodes. So you can actually fit those amount of nodes in the cluster to fit your needs and requirements. Based on the cloud you're in, and we'll talk about the differences between Azure and AWS. There are some limits on cluster size we'll talk about here in a little bit. Also, auto host remediation. If there's an issue with one of the nodes in cloud clusters, you don't have to do anything. Our portal automatically sees that. It ejects the nodes out of the cluster. It adds new nodes into the cluster. You don't have to touch anything. If for some reason something happens and you need to manually eject it, you can manually eject the node yourself. And again, it'll automatically reprovision a node back into that cluster for you. DR cost optimizations. So think about being able to just put up what you need for DR and then be able to expand that cluster or have multiple clusters once you get into a full DR scenario. We have a lot of customers who do things like pilot-like clusters, where they only provision what they need for the target for replication, and then expand those clusters or deploy more clusters once they go into an actual DR event. So only deploy what you need for replication, or also use things like Hibernate and Resume as well. In AWS, we support that functionality where basically we back everything up to S3 storage, release the nodes. That way you're only incurring minimal storage cost. When you need that, you resume the cluster. We bring those nodes back into the cluster, and then you start incurring compute cost again. So think about it, based on your recovery time objective or your recovery point objective, you could basically, there's some automation that Dwayne on our team, who's done a lot of stuff out there and a lot of videos out there on YouTube channels for Nutanix about being able to use things like our playbooks in Prism Central to schedule things, to automatically resume a cluster, do replication to it. When the replication is done, hibernate that cluster, and then only incur the storage cost, and do that on a periodic basis based on your requirement. And then use our things like Beam for cost visibility and governance. And then think about your time to value, right? Think about when you have to procure hardware in your data center, the whole process, right? I have to go through, choose a hardware vendor, order the nodes, get those nodes in, go through the whole ASIC tag management and so forth, rack and stack, power and cool, networking all those nodes, make sure I have enough in data center to support that, and how long that process takes. You can be up and running with the cloud cluster in 45 minutes in AWS and start deploying workloads to it. And then it's on demand, scale up or down, right? So again, be able to scale up those clusters to what you need, scale them back down to minimal footprint, be able to rapidly scale very quickly with your applications in the cloud, and then think about physical presence, right? So you can have global expansion in cloud data centers without actually having any of your physical locations there. And I'll show you how we're available throughout the world, whether you're using AWS, Azure, or one of our managed servers, bare metal as a service partners. So all these things are built into Nutanix Cloud clusters, all built into the portal that we use. And so very quickly and easily to get up and running with Nutanix Cloud clusters. So I talked about global availability. So you see here, AWS is a very large footprint. They were the first one that we went with. We have 29 regions for that, 7 bare metal node types. When we first deployed AWS, we only had a handful, and we're always looking for new nodes and expanding those nodes out. And then you see our DC expansion as well has grown. Also too, with AWS, we originally deployed with 16 node clusters, then it went to 21, and now it's 28 node clusters. With Azure, we have 2 different instance types out there, 7 regions out there, another one coming on this year that you see in the light blue. And then we have 13 node clusters. You can do up to 16. And again, those things change out as we improve the service over time. We launched Azure in October of last year at Ignite. And then we also too have our bare metal as a service partners to give us even more physical presence out there for global availability. So depending on where you need to deploy and what options you have, we have different options for you for that. So let's kind of dive into what the infrastructure looks like on Azure. So when you want to connect up your infrastructure or connect up to a different public cloud, for example, what you'll have is basically a VNet where you'll do things like VPN, Direct Connect, or Express Route to connect up. Then what we have is we have 2 different VNets for clusters. Now these VNets will deploy in Azure under your Azure accounts. But through our portal, we can create the VNets for you, or you can deploy in your existing VNets with some configuration. We have a VNet for our clusters where those get deployed. And then we have a VNet that has Prism Central and our Flow Gateway. Now, because of some network changes in Azure and some things we have to do there, we have to deploy Prism Central and we have to deploy Floor networking for overlay and VPC networking. Once that's in, you can connect up through peering and talk to any native Azure services you have out there. And so forth, and connect back to on-prem. Again, use replication, move your base images around for Citrix, protect your persistent desktops, and so forth, and all connected back up to on-prem. Now, if we go into a little bit more layout of what that looks like for the architecture for Azure, you see here that we have 3 VNets, right? So I mentioned before, we deploy 2 VNets, one for the cluster with the bare metal Azure Ready nodes for Nutanix, And then we deploy one that has our Flow Gateway and Prism Central. Now, those VNets can be connected via peering to a hub VNet, and that hub VNet will connect you out to other services, whether they're in native Azure services, another cloud like AWS, or connected back on-prem to your existing private cloud infrastructure for Nutanix on premises. So that hub VNet is kind of the one that brings you in via that connectivity, and then we'll talk to the other VNets where we deploy our infrastructure for cloud clusters in Azure. Now, what does Azure look like as far as, we kind of click down. I showed you the big map of all three. This is what the map looks like of just Azure as well. So you see here that we initially launched with in US with US East 1 and 2, US North Central, and US West. Then we expanded out to Asia and Australia, doing Europe, and coming later this year, we'll have Japan, East, and Tokyo as well. Today, we have two different node types. So we have the AN36P and the AN36 node types. Now, depending on where you deploy, will depend on the node type. US East and West 2 are all AN36, but everywhere else is AN36P. Now, we also have some reference architecture guides coming that will be available on our portal for Citrix on Azure and NC2. And we use the AN36P node types, and we test that out of the US North Central region. So we'll have guides out there coming soon. So you can see some reference architecture in our testing that we do with Logon VSI for a number of desktops per node, whether it's or a number of sessions per node, depending on single session or multi-session out there in Azure. So what does AWS look like? AWS is a little bit simpler infrastructure. You will deploy in your VPC, and everything is done in that VPC. We'll use the Amazon EC2 bare metal nodes. And then you connect back to on-prem via VPN or direct connect. And again, being able to talk to native AWS services as well. Your Flow Gateway and Prism Central are optional in AWS. And so it's a little more simpler, but again, you deploy into your VPC, and then you have that connectivity back to any services or back to on-prem. And so the AWS architecture is a little more simpler because they are more further along with their offering. And again, they were our first one. They already had their bare metal offering. We were able to take advantage of the APIs to easily spin up clusters, spin them down, and so forth, all through our Nutanix portal. So what does availability look like for when we click down into AWS? So 24 regions and 5 metal types we'll have 7 soon. And you see the availability and the different node types that we have in this slide. So you have a little more presence out there with AWS. Again, they had that bare metal offering already, so a little more mature. And you see the different node types out there. Now, we also have available today on our portal some reference architecture for Citrix on AWS with cloud clusters. And we did that on the i3 node types for that offering. Now, you can use whatever fits your need. We have some customers that use i3M because they need more memory or more storage heavy, things like persistent desktops. But we also do things I'll talk about where we have mixed node support as well for AWS. We also recently added GPU node types. So those will support 8 NVIDIA T4 GPUs. That way, if you have GPU workloads you need to protect into the cloud for bursting or disaster recovery, or just for infrastructure as a service, we can meet that need with Citrix as well by using those NVIDIA type nodes with the 8 T4s in them. So hibernate and resume. So this is available in GA on AWS. And so the main thing here is being able to only get charged for compute consumption when you're actually using it. So what you do is basically you go into the portal, you tell it to hibernate, it backs everything up to S3. And then when you want to resume, go back in the portal, tell it to resume, and it brings that cluster back up and restores from S3 storage. Now, the time it takes will all depend on the amount of data that you have in the cluster, but this helps you kind of keep that cost awareness by only being charged for compute when you need to, and not have to be charged for it when they're just sitting there idle. So this is today GA in AWS, and we're not yet quite there yet with Azure yet, but stay tuned for that. The other thing we support in AWS also is heterogeneous clusters. Excuse me. What that is mixed node cluster types. So you can combine nodes. The main thing here is that you need to start off with 3 nodes of one node type. So in this example here, so start with 3 of I3EN, and maybe those 3 nodes meet your storage needs capacity because there are more dense storage nodes. And then you just need more compute in the cluster, and then you can start adding more I3 nodes up until the cluster capacity of 28 nodes in AWS. You can also mix the M4 DN and the Z1 DN as well in the same cluster. You cannot mix the G4 DN nodes in the same cluster today. But this gives you some flexibility when you're looking at things like DR or right size capacity and so forth. When you have that initial pilot cluster for the replication target, pick those more storage dense nodes. And then when you go into a DR mode or need to burst out to that, put more compute nodes in there that are not as heavy storage dense if you don't have those requirements. And again, the AWS only today that does this. We have the portal, as I mentioned. So our portal is kind of like your heads up display and your operational piece all for it. So think of this as if you're a Nutanix customer today, think about your foundation, how you foundation your clusters for on-prem. This is our foundation in management for the cloud. So what you'll do in here is you'll go in and do your initial cluster deployments. You'll connect in your cloud accounts, whether that's AWS or Azure or both. Any clouds we add in the future. You'll do things like deploy the cluster, destroy the cluster, expand, contract, hibernate, resume. That's all done from this portal. Once you're done with that operational aspect of it, everything else you'll do as far as VM management, replication, integration with Citrix, that's all done from Prism and Prism Central, all the same consoles you're used to in your data center today for private cloud with Nutanix. You'll get access to this through mynutanix.com. You'll go in there and pick, NC2 or cloud clusters, and it'll take you into the cloud clusters portal to do all your foundation and operational management of your clusters that you deploy. So what about license portability? So we have that license portability, so no lock-in here. So you can take your licenses and move those across clouds, right? You could be on-prem today, you want to expand out to AWS or Azure tomorrow, you want to move from Azure to AWS or vice versa, you can take your licensing, at least from the Nutanix software standpoint, with you for that. So no lock-in there, completely mobile across clouds with licensing. What's the billing model look like? So you pay the cloud vendor, and that's going to be Azure or AWS. You pay them for the cloud consumption. So again, you plug in your cloud accounts into the portal. You get billed directly from that into your cloud accounts for the consumption of the hardware and the cloud resources. You pay us the software. And depending on the software that you're using, we'll talk about that. You may have to pay us extra, or you may have to go through like Cloud Commit and Pay As You Go, which we'll talk about that. But things like CBL, our capacity-based licensing, or our per-user VDI licensing are portable across on-prem and different cloud for that license portability. So what does that look like? We get more specific here. So we have pay-as-you-go. Basically, this is on demand. You're kind of paying this monthly, predictable. And then Cloud Commit is kind of like in your yearly type commit. So for example, if I wanted to have a pilot cluster that I need out there to replicate to, I might want to do Cloud Commit for that. And then when I do have to burst out or go into DR for temporarily and not have to be out there long-term like that, that's when I could use pay-as-you-go for that license for us. The other option is bring your own licensing. And this is going to be things like, reallocate your capacity-based licensing or use our VDI per user licensing as well to be able to easily move that across on-prem and public cloud or multiple public clouds. Now we drill down a little more into AWS and to Azure. So you have our software and the route to market, which is BYO, pay-as-you-go, Cloud Commit. We are also in the Azure Marketplace for pay-as-you-go and Cloud Commit. And then looking at the actual cloud consumption cost, you have the options of on-demand, reserved, and convertible for AWS. And for Azure, you have on-demand and reserved. So we're also in the marketplace as well for Azure. So you can go directly to the marketplace and do all your procurement there for your consumption for our software and also for the consumption of the Azure resources, all right from the Azure marketplace. We are not in AWS right now, but we are in Azure for the marketplace. As far as licensing, so I mentioned that we have our per user VDI licensing, and this comes in your tiers of Starter, Pro, and Ultimate. Now, all 3 editions include things like disaster recovery, but if you want to use this licensing on our cloud clusters offering, you have to have the Ultimate tier for that. That's all included in the Ultimate tier. But you see here that you're pretty much licensing the same as what your broker licensing is for this. And we support, things like, transferable across different infrastructure. Again, you're just paying the software at this time. So you can transfer that from Lenovo nodes to HPE nodes to NX nodes, but also into our cloud nodes and clusters in AWS as well. Disaster recovery is included. If you want to do disaster recovery or use this in AWS or Azure or cloud clusters, you have to have the Ultimate tier for that. You can do things like time zones and shift workers to do that. And your cluster, it doesn't matter if you have 5 nodes, 16 nodes, or 35 nodes in the cluster, you're only paying for the user headcount on that cluster. You're not paying for the nodes or the hardware specifications like you do with our capacity-based licensing. You're licensed by user only, so we don't care of if you have 600 users across 32 nodes or 600 users across 16 nodes or whatever. You only pay for the number of users in the cluster, not for the number of, the number of users in your environment, not for the number of nodes in the cluster. Now, if we kind of go through a decision tree, here's some things here. If you want DR, then DR is included. Again, if you need DR in cloud clusters, you need Ultimate tier for that. You want to go pure software, so you pay us for the software, and then you go buy hardware from the vendor of your choice. You just worry about the number of users, not how much hardware you have in your environment, number of nodes in the cluster, etc. And then if you want, better TCO, then you go with the per user. So again, you pay us for the software and then go pick the hardware of your choice for that. Again, we don't care about the number of nodes, how much hardware. It's all about the number of users matching your broker. So there's DaaS licensing, so there's virtual apps and desktops licensing. Kind of comparison here real quick. The main thing here is that you have to have Prism Central and Flow in Azure. AWS is optional. You have more flexibility on hardware in Azure. AWS, we have 2 nodes today. Your cluster maximum, a little bit larger today in AWS. Again, it was smaller and then increased over time. GPU is a big one here. So we do have GPU nodes today in AWS. The other requirements, we don't have GPU nodes in Azure today. Marketplace, Azure, Gov region, AWS right now. Hibernation, AWS. And then when I get into Citrix pieces right here, you have your different options here for our integration. So AWS, it's all Prism elements. So it's the same plugins that you use today for AHV, for Citrix DaaS, or for workshops and desktops. For Azure, since we have PC and the Flow networking with the overlay and the VPCs, we do have a PC Prism Central based plugin in early access for those customers who are using clusters in Azure, and that should be general available for Azure here pretty soon. What does Citrix look like on here? Something about use cases, right? So deploy your choice of control plane, whether using the virtual apps and desktops control plane or using the DaaS control plane, and then use cloud clusters to simply scale your EUC infrastructure in the cloud. So DRs are big use case that we use. We're also seeing things like bursting for the on-demand elasticity. We also have requirements of customers who need to scale pretty quickly and don't have the time to go through the full procurement process of physical hardware in their data center. And then things like migration or test and dev, where you may not have the capacity on-prem to change different software versions, AHV, AOS versions, Citrix upgrades, and so forth. Do that into the cloud. When that's all ready to go, use our same tools to move that back to on-prem with cloud clusters and connect back to your private cloud infrastructure once that's all proved out and approved to go into production. As far as different things here for Citrix, so we fully support your base images, MCS, PVS, persistent desktops, your choice of control plane, the other optional components from Citrix that you need to deploy. And then for both Azure and AWS, we are Citrix Ready certified. So you can go ahead and extend out that into the cloud. Same look and feel as Citrix on AHV. The only caveat here is that AWS has that PE plugin that you are all used to today. if you're running AHV for Azure, we are going to have new PC plugins, but we fully support machine creation services and provisioning in AWS and Azure on top of cloud clusters. That bursting type use case we talked about, or seasonal or whatever, we do have a video out there on the portal, or I'm sorry, on our website that talks about bursting under 2 hours. So that time to value, you know, that quick deployment in case that seasonal use case, and be able to basically take that and replicate those images and deploy those images out there very quickly. So think about, you know, mergers and acquisitions, rapid growth, temp seasonal, disaster recovery, and so forth for that quick time to value use case. We actually have a video showing that in under 2 hours of doing 2,000 desktops. Licensing. So what does licensing look like from Citrix? So Citrix just announced their universal licensing, which is basically taking their hybrid rights licensing and allows you to pick which control plane you want to use and which cloud you want to use. So if you want to run Citrix on top of this, you either have to have the universal licensing from Citrix, or you have to have the new subscription on-premises term-based licensing as well for the other option. There's a nice blog out there from Citrix. Go ahead and look at that blog. That's in the link at the bottom, or you can just look at universal licensing, and that blog comes up and fully explains that. But you have to look at universal licensing or the new on-premises term licensing to run clusters in the cloud with Nutanix. Previously, it was either use Citrix DaaS, have hybrid rights licensing, or run 1912 LTSR. But that all changes now with this new announcement for universal and for the subscription on-premises term licensing as well. Our integration points for Citrix. So all the same look and feel that you have on-prem today with AHV. So our PE plugin for Studio. Again, if you're going to use Azure, that does require a PC-based plugin. From there, our Director plugin for all the VM level performance statistics for storage. We also have the integration with the Citrix DaaS control plane and that easy one-click deployment from Prism to be able to deploy those cloud connectors for you. And we fully support provisioning on this with AWS and Azure, excuse me, and any other clouds we go to in the future as well with cloud clusters. No changes there. We also have a thing now called AHV templates. So when you do use our new Prism Central based plugin for Azure, you will create a template. And that template is used to deploy across clusters. The nice thing with templates too, if the clusters are under the same Prism Central instance, they will deploy that image across multiple clusters under that same PC instance. Those of you today on Nutanix, you're all using protection domains to do that, or using our protection policies to do that. But with AHV templates, which the new PC-based plugin will use, that will do multi-cluster deployment for you of your base images using MCS, as long as they're on the same Prism Central instance using that PC-based plugin. Azure is going to be GA soon for on-prem. Look for that later this year, Prism Central, but it's going to help you better manage those images across multiple clusters under the same Prism Central instance. Provisioning in the cloud. So what does that look like for us? Again, there's no difference if you're running AHV in your data center or AHV on cloud clusters. It's the same look and feel. It's the exact same PVS. No changes there. Simply just take your VHDX and your PVP files for PVS and copy those to your Vita store. We're using PVS on Azure or AWS. No change there. A little bit different from the native cloud for provisioning, which is available on Microsoft today, where you have to have some different things here, like the image portability service, your OS limitations, and also looking at your UEFI boot of Gen 2 Azure VMs. There's no difference between cloud clusters or AHV on-prem. It's the exact same as the main point here. So a little bit difference there from native cloud provisioning with provisioning for Citrix versus what we have with cloud clusters using the same exact mechanisms you use on-prem. So you want to start that journey. So it's pretty easy to start that journey. So the first thing on that journey is time to cloud matters, right? We talk about, being able to have that time to value, quickly be able up and running in the cloud. So the main thing here is once you have your cloud connectivity on-prem, your networking and so forth, you deploy the clusters, and then you just start, protecting and replicating that infrastructure and those images across, or those persistent images across to the cloud. Again, that video shows you how quickly you can use an AWS, 2 hours total, or under 2 hours total, 2,000 desktops. And that's building the cluster with the clusters portal. So deploying that, a 16-node cluster, that is connecting back to on-prem, that is using our protection domain to replicate the image, and then going through the MCS process to deploy 2,000 desktops. And again, that's all under 2 hours. So time to cloud matters, right? The next thing, efficiency in public cloud. So the main thing with clusters is that you have the full bare metal node to size your VMs however you want to. Have your cluster sizes as big or small as you want, up to the limits, minimum of 3, versus if you're going to native public cloud where you have t-shirt sizes and that's flexible, different options there. For us, on demand, 3 nodes, scale that out, have multiple clusters depending on, scale it out to a larger size. The size depends on your cloud infrastructure that you're using, AWS, Azure. The flexibility, same tools, no refactoring, and then it's all SSD and NVMe back storage as well for performance underneath. And then you have your options of your different hardware types as well for the bare metal nodes. And again, customize and flexibility are the key things here. So why hybrid multi-cloud with Nutanix? That's going to be, build your hybrid cloud in hours. Again, you can be up, 45 minutes to build a cluster in AWS once you click go in the portal to deploy that cluster. Manage all clouds as one, the same exact look and feel interfaces, Prism Element, Prism Central, all the same tools you use on-prem, you use in the cloud. Think about your disaster recovery time, how quickly and up and running you can get in that, especially, being able to easily test, expand, that kind of stuff with the cloud clusters. Cloud migration, right? So again, it's just replicating using our built-in protection domains or our protection policies. No refactoring, no code change, just replicate and go. Think about your TCO. And then again, same software, same licenses. Bring your own licenses, CBL, our VDI per user licenses, all that kind of stuff. There's links at the bottom. We have some customer references also, how quickly they get up and running with AWS, and then the white paper from IDC as well. So all those things. And with that, I think I'm on good time here. Additional resources. So we do have a test drive for AWS. That same video of demo of 2,000 desktops bursting is a click-through demo of that. You've seen our interfaces for Prism, for cloud clusters, all that stuff. That same process I go through in that demo, you can easily click through with this test drive. Look for Azure coming soon as well. Resources, I'll leave this up and I'm gonna go ahead and look at the questions here. So let me see, it looks like Joe answered, I'd like to answer this question live. I am using multiple cloud platform like GCP and AWS. Do I need multiple license from Nutanix? So no, you don't need multiple license from Nutanix. We're not in GCP right now. We are in Azure and AWS. Like we talked about, if you're capacity-based licensing or if you're the per user licensing. So for example, when you do per user licensing, you just allocate the number of users that you have out of your total pool of per user licensing to those different clouds, right? So I have 1,000 licenses, for example, of the per user licensing. I have 500 in AWS, I have 500 in Azure. So I just split those out between those clusters and those clouds at my pool of licensing. So you don't have to have multiple licenses. You just use the licensing you have. If you're CBL, same thing, is reallocate. As long as you have the proper amount of CBL to cover that, you can split that between the clouds. So we answered that one. So let me see here. The next one, if I use regions in different countries, do I need separate country-specific licenses? Is that more from Nutanix or from which one are you there, or for like the platform you're on top? The main thing is you just follow the export rules of that software for those the country specific, but I don't think anything past that. Is it allowed to run client OS on AWS clusters? It is, but there are some caveats there, and you have to work that with Microsoft for Windows 10. We will be supporting other instance types like dedicated as well to help you with that. So that further helps that conversation of the whole dedicated. But the main thing there is talk to Microsoft on that, because we have different customers who have different allowances of Microsoft and what they can run outside of Azure. So make sure you follow up with Microsoft on that, or look at the dedicated instances when we support that. i3 Metal is no longer to sell by, only i3N. If a customer has credits to buy 823, they can use i3 Metal. Also end of support for i3 Metal by 8/2026. So I'll double check on that one. But we also still check with your rep too as well on that one for the i3 Metal piece. Is Nutanix taking care of AHV, AOS, NCC upgrades, or is that under the customer responsibility? So that is your responsibility. This is not a managed service. This is you manage this, the customer manages this. So this is like, when you run LCM on-prem, you run LCM on cloud clusters. So when you want to go through and do updates for AOS, AHV, NCC, files, flow, any of that stuff, that's all done by you using LCM. So you have to look at that same way. So basically, you're taking the software, running it on bare loads in the cloud, but you manage that. It's not a managed service. We do have a managed service for DR that takes care of that for you, but that's not cloud clusters. That's our DR as a service offering. The next question here: are there any limitations with NC2 clusters compared to using traditional on-prem clusters? No, there is not. The only limitations you'll have is the hardware bare metal node types. So, you're limited to what we can support in the cloud for that. But as far as the software piece, no, it's pretty much the exact same as on-prem. There are some stuff with Azure because we have the VPC and the overlay stuff with Prism Central. So I know that we're changing applications for that. Like, for example, we have files in Tech Preview today that will support VPCs and overlays. And so that's the only caveat there for that. But we are making sure that all of our software can support VPCs and overlays because of the Azure requirements. Citrix is the preferred partner for EUC and Nutanix, but we'll have more about our strategy and roadmap around Frame that we can share soon. No comment on that one. The next question, because we hear about Citrix. The next question: can Rubrik be used as a backup solution, and will these slides be available for download? So Rubrik will be able to integrate, so you can use that. As far as the slides, yep, we can send a PDF out of the slides for you. So no problem there. I think that's all in the QA. There was one about multi-session. So that kind of went through quickly. I'll address that. So you can use multi-session Windows Server OS on AWS. Multi-session Windows 10, as you know, is only available in Azure, and if you're on the Azure Fabric. So that's the only difference there for multi-session. But multi-session Server OS, have at it. Go to town. Multi-session client OS, Azure only on the AVD Fabric. So there's the answer to that one. I think I got all the questions here. Let me go back to you, Angela. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing, and you can wrap things up as far as the
Thanks.
user group stuff. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jarian. We only have a couple slides here, folks. Just want to let everyone know that we are giving away Nutanix luggage for those that participated on the call today. The winner will be notified by email, and we'll also make an announcement on Twitter on the community account Nutanix Nation. So
hey, I got a question for you about that. Does the presenter get some for presenting the first one?
Maybe. Depends is always a good answer. As well, check out the Nutanix user group forum on the community site. Great way to stay connected with your peers and understand how they're using our technology. If you scan the QR code, it will take you directly there. And finally, if you're going to be attending .next in Chicago in May, be sure to come by and say hi at the community lounge. A lot of us that's our home base. And a little secret, I tend to give away a lot of swag. So that's another, should be some motivation for checking out the community lounge. So with that, thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the week.